I've been listening to music all my life. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Jazz Center of the World. My name is Ralph Brown, and this is my private little music hangout paradise place. I don't like to call it a man cave because I just don't like that term. This is my nightclub here in the basement. I remember my grandpa putting records on, and I was fascinated by the fact that he could put this piece of plastic on and music would come out. Flip it over and it'd be a different song. I just thought that was an amazing invention. Thank you, Thomas Edison. I remember my mom and dad used to buy me Bozo the Clown records when I was a little kid. You sit there for hours and just listen to the records, these kids' records. They used to say it was my favorite toy. When I got old enough to go down to the library and get my own library card, I remember the first 3 records I bought was, checked out, was a Charlie Parker record, a Dave Brubeck record, and this Grand Canyon Suite, which it's a study of how an orchestra can just be a full-blown orchestra thing and sound like nature or something like that. And Leonard Bernstein, he's my favorite conductor on the classical stuff. But as you can see, I got about 4 or 5 copies of this thing, the Grand Canyon Suite. I actually got to go see the Grand Canyon last summer, a couple summers ago, when my son got married out in Las Vegas. So anyway, that was some of the first records that I came home with from the library. It sounds like the Grand Canyon. It sounds like the weather at the Grand Canyon. It starts off with Sunrise, you know, the names of the things. Sunrise, the Painted Desert, On the Trail. Sounds like donkeys going down the thing, you know, the trail. Sunset, Cloudburst. Sounds like a storm just created from an orchestra. It's a magnificent piece of music. I love it. My sister Pam started bringing home records when she started dating Rudy. She started bringing home these rhythm and blues records that Rudy was listening to, and it opened up a whole new thing to me. And I remember one time I was down at Hayes Record Shop, and I bought a 45 by this guy named Bobby Bland. It was called Yield Not to Temptation. But I looked up and then I saw this on the wall, and it was called 2 Steps from the Blues, Bobby Bland. And that was the first record I ever bought, first album I ever bought. And it started a bad habit that's lasted all my life, and I've bought so many albums over through the years. Oh my goodness, best song. You can't do that. Probably I Pity the Fool is probably what I like probably that the best. It's got a nice saxophone solo in it, just a real strong saxophone solo in it. But this is a great album. I mean, look at this stuff. This is great. Look at them old microphones. That's the same type of microphone that Boba Fett's talking into over there. They were Electra something. I can't even remember. Electra Voice something. So that's just a standard back there. Everybody's dressed up in a suit, you know. Real horn players playing real horns, you know. I saw Bobby Bland one time at the Cotillion. Me and Pat Augustine were the only 2 white boys in the whole place. True story. When I joined the Imperials, one of the songs that they were playing was this song called Little Boy Blue, and I enjoyed being able to do that. The Imperials was that group that's pictured over there on the wall. Eddie Corral, Jim Frick, Gary LeClaire, Kenny Hill, and Ray Wiggins, and Galen Bland. That's who that was, the Imperials. They had their own club out on 30th Street called the Midnight Hour back in the mid-'60s. They wanted to hire some horns, and I'd been playing with this band called the Soul Brothers, me and Galen. And Galen was a trumpet player. They wanted to hire some horns, and they had hired a couple of friends of theirs from high school, these trumpet players, but they just basically had to read music, and they sounded like marching band musicians, no offense. But they had matinees down at the Hermit Club on Saturdays, and the Soul Brothers would go in there, and one of the tunes we'd learned was kind of a jazz tune called The Sidewinder, originally by Lee Morgan. We kind of did the James Brown version of it. And Eddie heard us doing that, and he says, them are the 2 cats that we need to hire for the band to do the horn section. So when the Imperials hired me and Galen, I thought we'd hit right up here, you know, in the echelon of Hutchinson bands, and I guess in a way it was, because they'd had a 10-year history out at the Fireside Club before that, and they'd opened up their own club and brought some entertainers to town, like B.B. King and Rufus Thomas and the Detroit Wheels, and I'm not sure somebody else, a few other people, but it was a happening era in this town around that time for music and stuff. And I was just glad to be a part of it. I'm still playing. So where do I start going through here? We got Jimi Hendrix, Dr. John, Stan Getz, Clifton Chenier, Ry Cooder, Otis Redding, Santana, Mongo Santa Maria, Herbie Mann, Jimmy McCracklin, and Thelonious Monk. I have more records by him than any other artist. I counted them one time, but I lost track. This is the first one I remember ever hearing. I was over at my friend's Chuck Burke's house. He had this record. It's called Monk's Time. It's Monk's Time. The end of Lulu's back in town on this thing. He comes in after the drum solo, just solo Monk. I've often described it as music dying, the way he can totally deconstructs this song and just goes at it. Anybody knows about Thelonious Monk, how unique his sound was. And anyway, Monk's my favorite cat right there. I got a lot of his stuff. I like this. I like this too. This is one thing that happened to me. This is a nice story behind it. Free Jazz by Ornette Coleman. Okay, the double quartet. Means he had two of everything. First time I ever saw a Jackson Pollock print, introduced me to Jackson Pollock. I'm going, what is this, and shoo. How I got this record, I was, my first year of playing saxophone, I was up at the high school playing in the stage band, the little jazz type stage band, reading charts, in a saxophone section. And our instructor, Jim Daly, invited us over to his house. A few of us who, listened to, who were more serious, I think he thought it was, because he didn't invite the whole band. But we were listening to records and stuff, and he was going, I got a couple records here that I just don't really like. And one of them was a Charles Brown records, of all things. He didn't like it because it had a real cheesy sounding organ in it, and it does, but it's a great album. This other one was this Free Jazz album by Ornette Coleman. First time I'd ever heard of Ornette Coleman either. And for some reason, he ended up giving them to me, and I took them going, thanks a lot. He hated them. I loved it. So what's that tell you about the jazz instructor gives away Charles Brown and Ornette Coleman records to me, and I love them. Anyway, that's the story behind that. And from there on, Ornette, he's in the, Jazz Hall of Fame. He's one of the cats who changed jazz. There's not too many people who actually done that. You go down the list, the history of jazz, and he's one of the cats who started this thing called free jazz. He tipped everybody out because he showed up with like a plastic alto saxophone, same thing that Charlie Parker he played. But then he also did an album where he played violin and trumpet along with alto saxophone. And it's an amazing album. It's recorded live in Stockholm. I can't think of the other guys' names, David something, and I can't think of what their names are, but what I remember about that album, particularly how I got introduced to that Ornette Coleman album, is I was over at Bobby Pena's one day and watching videos that Bobby had. He had this roller coaster video, people like riding on a roller coaster, and he was playing that Ornette Coleman with the trio at Stockholm when he's playing violin and trumpet. This was also my introduction to Eric Dolphy, bass clarinet on this thing here. First time I heard a bass of Eric Dolphy, or a bass clarinet doing jazz, you might say. It's a wonderful album. Don Cherry, Freddie Hubbard, Scott LaFaro, Charlie Hayden, Billy Higgins, Ed Blackwell. Free jazz. Great stuff. And he changed the way jazz was. He introduced bebop. And then I got into this one. This was given to me, and it's Ornette Coleman. He introduced free jazz. And then there was this cat over here named Jimi Hendrix. He came along and you might say introduced free guitar. I remember the first time I ever heard it. It was over at our guitar player Chris Allen's house. He had the 45, the single of Hey Joe on one side and The Wind Cried Mary on the other side. And we just spent the whole night just listening to one side and then the other, just trying to figure out what is this guy doing on the guitar, because nothing else ever sounded like it. There was no sounds out there that sounded like Jimi Hendrix's guitar. This was his second album, The Jimi Hendrix Experience, Axis Bold as Love. And just, to give you an idea of what records were like back then, see, it folds out into that wonderful piece of artwork that you could stare and look at and just wonder about what the heck is going on with this here. Hippies, big afros, sign of the times. It's a wonderful record. I got to see, and I'm proud to say, that I got to see Jimi Hendrix in November of '68 up in Kansas City at the Municipal Auditorium. They came up there and did a show, and about 4 of us got in I think it was Chuck's T-Bird, and we drove up there and got to see it. It was an amazing thing. He came out in all these different colors of clothes, these same sort of clothes, looking almost just like that, scarves. And if you've ever seen Jimi Hendrix, he was a very colorful person. Came out there with these Marshall stacks. I loved that his bass player had Sun Coliseum stacks for his bass rig, which I've always just enjoyed Sun amplifiers. It was wonderful. There was two things that amazed me during that especially. He had this big ring on his finger or somewhere on his hand. Something. He broke a guitar string and the band kept playing and he somehow was able to change his own string and finish the song, but then he said, "Excuse me while I tune." And, well, he's left-handed. He went whang and just tuned the thing, and then they just right into another song. I've never seen anything like it. The other thing, and I just saw a picture on the wonderful media thing that comes through Jimi Hendrix, the roadies holding up the Marshall amp. He ended up the show by attacking a Marshall amp, making love to it, or whatever you want to call it. He was throwing his guitar into it. He was humping the amplifier stack. He was throwing into it. He ended up throwing his guitar into the amp, and it stuck into one of the speakers and was sticking out and just making these horrible squealing crazy sounds. His bass player just ended up just grabbing all the strings and setting them in front of the amp and walking off. It was ridiculous. I mean, that sounds, it's all theatrical and stuff, but it was the Jimi Hendrix experience. I'm glad to tell people I got to see this cat because he's another one that changed the face of music. I bought this 8-track for Rudy on his birthday. And we used to ride around in his Firebird listening to this stuff. The end. Jimi Hendrix. We got this album here called The Best of Otis Redding. Here's the front of it, kind of a newspaper clippings. One of the newspaper clippings that stunned me was when I was getting ready to go to work one morning, and I'm reading the paper, and it says, Otis Redding died in a plane crash. He was 26 years old. I'm like, shoo-wee. It just killed me. What happened is way back when he had this song, trying to find it on here, called Pain in My Heart, right there, Pain in My Heart. We used to have these little transistor radios, and we would put them in our rooms at night and put them under our pillows so nobody could hear us listening to them stuff. And we would just wait for the disc jockey to play a song. You'd tune in different stations and just hope you'd find this song. And you'd turn in random stuff, and I heard this song, Pain in My Heart. And I would stay awake at night trying to hear this song. So, yeah, people if anybody even remembers Otis Redding, they think about the Sitting on the Dock of the Bay song. And to me, that was one of the weakest songs he ever did. This man had a voice that was just amazing, just the epitome of soul. And it was a tragic loss that the world lost him at 26. He's definitely one of my favorite artists. You put him up there in the top 10. He's a wonderful man. I remembered one time I was playing in a band, the Imperials, I talked about earlier. We playing a homecoming dance up at K-State up in Manhattan, and our lead singer, Kenny Hill, decided to start the whole evening off with this extremely slow song called Good to Me by Otis Redding. And my initial reaction was like, what are you doing? You know, let's hit him with a bang to begin with. And he started with this really, really slow song, and bang, from the beginning, bang, all these wonderfully dressed young prom girl people and these tuxedoed men come out there, and they started slow dancing together. And from the rest of the evening, they were out there boogie-woogieing and stuff. But I thought it was amazing how to just be able to do that with a slow song, to have everybody come out there and just start dancing. That rarely ever happens. Do I ever start off an evening with a slow song? Otis Redding, y'all. Check out some of his stuff.